On October the 22nd, I'll be running an interview on my new podcast with Rutgers anti-fascism historian Mark Bray. Here's his photo from Turning Point USA's Professor Watch List, which was Charlie Kirk's first fascist project. From beyond the grave, Kirk got his way because you will have seen Mark in the news recently. He had to flee the US. The campaign against him has been ongoing about 8 years now, but was recently catalyzed by claims that Antifa murdered Charlie Kirk. There was also Trump's September 22 executive order designating Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization, and the Turning Point USA chapter at Rutgers started a petition to have Bray fired for his scholarship. So Bray, his partner, and 2 young kids fled to Spain after receiving a surge of death threats, including one that said, "I will kill you in front of your students." Now, on one hand, all of this shows just how fascist the emerging regime and its supporters can be, that they won't tolerate scholarship about anti-fascism. But on the other hand, it also shows how fragile this regime can be because they can't tolerate scholarship about anti-fascism. So we know what Trump and Turning Point and, the late Kirk were up to. I want to look at an example of mainstream publications tacitly accepting the Trump and Turning Point USA framing on Antifa and Bray. Here's the New York Times lead on the story about Bray's flight to Spain. Mark Bray was teaching courses on anti-fascism. Turning Point USA accused him of belonging to Antifa, which he denies. Okay, accused him of belonging to Antifa. Do a thought experiment here and replace Antifa with Hamas. You see what they're doing here? Consciously or unconsciously? By not contextualizing and clarifying that Antifa is a political attitude and tendency and not a centralized political organization with any kind of power, here is the paper of record co-signing Turning Point USA's framework. So without underlying that anti-fascists in the US are responsible for virtually no political violence over past decades, the New York Times is just tossing gas on the fire here, endorsing the premise of the fascist panic, giving implicit permission for further escalations of state violence. Because, you just never know about Antifa. People are saying they are a violent organization. Shit like this isn't hard to fix. If the lead carried the phrase false accusation and the body had 2 to 3 sentences of fact-checking on Turning Point USA, no problem. So why does this happen? It's really easy to tinfoil hat this stuff, but the truth is that the New York Times is huge and opaque, and it would be impossible to track down the precise decision-making process of the writer, the editorial committee, the headline dude. What we can say is that the institutional motivations are twofold. If you make overtures or concessions to Trump and Turning Point, you protect access to things like the press pool, and Turning Point USA sources will keep talking to you. If you're on the opinion side of things like Ezra Klein, you can position yourself as the rational, both sides interpreter of world events. And this is what happens when you're in the business of media as opposed to being committed to accuracy and justice. Implying Antifa is a legitimately violent threat to peace-loving Americans is like suggesting anti-genocide protesters are scary or violent because pro-IDF protesters say they are and just taking their word for it. So I've interviewed Mark a few times, and I've relied on his excellent work on anti-fascist history and educational theory in the anarchist tradition, especially out of Spain. And the one thing I want to communicate about Mark is that he's a scholar. He's an academic. He's not really that charismatic, but he is unflappable. And he's been facing down these accusations for about 8 years, as I said, ever since his excellent book was published in the wake of Charlottesville. So here's the guy they're afraid of.
Organization mirrors the Nazis when Hitler was gaining power, the brown shirts. You guys show up at political rallies, you intimidate people, you beat people up, you disrupt meetings.
So first of all, I am not a member of any Antifa group, and Antifa is not a single group. Second, also to point out once again that disrupting a far-right event does not therefore mean you're far-right. Historically, we can see how anti-fascists have used a variety of tactics to disrupt fascist meetings. In the 20s and 30s, they would infiltrate events and sing and have singing protests over the speaker. There's a variety of tactics to do this, and really, fascism entails an illiberal politics, just like socialism or anarchism, but that does not mean they're the same. There are very clear political differences, and to reduce politics to tactics is really ahistorical and apolitical. Rather than looking at an action, let's look at why it's carried out and who it's carried out against.
Don't buy any squishy framing of this. It will make your brain squishy.